Hello. Welcome in, everyone. It's good to see everyone saying hello in the chat. I see we have Jeannie from the Minneapolis suburbs, Isaac from Queensland. Wow. And Emily from Texas. Welcome. Yeah, I hope you're staying nice and cool as well as you can. I've got my fan on the background, so hopefully the sound isn't too bad. But we're also trying to stay cool, so you may hear fans and ACs in our videos from time to time as well. Welcome in everyone to Bible Study Live. Oh, hey Tara, welcome in. Great to have you here. Yeah, well, as we kind of get started, today we're going to be talking about the first creation narrative in Genesis 1, and it kind of also spills over a little bit into Genesis 2. It kind of finishes in the first few verses of Genesis 2. And so we wanted to make sure to include the whole narrative. So we'll be looking, it's quite a bit of text that we'll be looking at today. So if we don't make it through the whole thing and we kind of get like focused on one thing because it's really interesting, that's okay. But we'll see what we get through. So before we begin, why don't we just start with some introductions? So I'll start, and then we're gonna pop around. Hello, everyone. My name is Micah Melody. I go by Micah or Melody or Micah Melody. My pronouns are she and her. And I'm calling in here from San Diego, where it is pretty warm, but not. I can't imagine if it's not nearly as warm as it would be in Bryan, Texas, Emily. So I feel you there.
I'll introduce myself. I'm Mack. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm in more northern California, so it's still about 90 degrees today, which for us is a bit cool recently. So I'll take it. Yeah, I've been at a couple of these at this point, but I'm a TMC community member and Bible scholar person. So happy to be here again.
I'm Brian. My pronouns are they, he. At this point in my spiritual journey, I consider myself an eclectic spiritualist because I have no spiritual home. So I'm a TMC member and just glad to actually be able to be a part of this discussion.
Well, so glad to have both of you. I also forgot to say I'm the director of community engagement with TMC, and so this is part of what I do. And I'm like so happy that I can be back doing this now that I don't have classes that we used to take up this time. So I'm really happy to be back. As before we begin and kind of reading through the passage, wanted to share a little bit of just some background framing that we wanted to bring to the passage. Just briefly, just as we're any notes that we wanted to kind of bring as well. And so one thing kind of to think about as we read the passage is I wanted to note that when looking at texts and looking at biblical texts, thinking about genre is always important. And so it's easy to kind of think about like what might be, if you read a letter that's written to someone or an email, for example, and you just think that it's someone writing a novel, that gives you a different interpretation. And so thinking about that. And within kind of biblical scholarship, like Genesis, the creation narratives are poetic, and they're poetic stories or poetic narratives. Also, depending on tradition. Oh, Brian, I just saw a friend in the background. Wonderful. We were just saying how appropriate that we're talking about creation and kind of the beauty of creation, because all of us have animal friends that might be visiting us from time to time. But yeah, poetic narrative and poetic, and so there's a lot of poetic language, and that I think that'll help us a little bit as we kind of jump in. Anything that either of the other two of you wanted to add before we get into reading the passage?
Okay, Okay, thanks, Brian. We both did the unmute thing at the same time. Just something as you're talking about genre, Micah Melody. I think that there's it's really important to think about genre because, like, I was raised in a very fundamentalist context. So for me, being raised in that context, this chapter in particular, Genesis as a whole, rather than reading as poetic narrative, I was taught very much that this needs to be a literal account of how the earth and everything came to be. And so that has definitely changed the way that I read this passage now that I don't read it that way. And I think going into this, one way that I sort of read it now differently in a way that I think that is helpful for me is I imagine the community who wrote this or who told these stories before they were written down, and why did they do that? And the way I think about it is it's a community trying to sort of reconcile, one, tell an origin story because we all love a good story, but also to try and understand their positionality with God and with themselves and with the rest of creation, and try to understand that interplay. And so I try to imagine what would it be like if I were to now try and rewrite some sort of creation story with what I think about who God is and how I think of myself as relating to God in the world, and what might that look like. And that sort of takes some of the pressure off of trying to be like, okay, well, historically, scientifically, this doesn't work. That doesn't matter as much for me anymore, because I think about it as like, okay, but like, what does this say about how these people conceptualized the divine and their world and their place in all of that?
I love that, of like thinking about what does this say about the people as well, that were writing this and thinking about God in this way. That's really great.
Thanks.
It's kind of amazing how like it kind of segues into one of the things that I looked in, which is where we don't really know the context in which context the authors of Genesis understood the text to be read or performed. We also don't really know the identity of the community or communities which Genesis overall actually addresses. And then it also brings into play, or it brings up for me, where does the ancient myth, primal androgyny, the first human combined with male and female within itself, which it reflects the primal unity within the earth. Like, what does myth have to do with how we interpret any type of religious based scripture? Because I'm always the one, I like to know where does roots come from, and so.
Thanks, Brian. I think, there's some really wonderful and very interesting scholarship that looks at kind of the mythologies and the kind of worldviews of the ancient world, and kind of looks at Genesis in light of those things, and the parallels and kind of the things that you can pull between the different traditions. It's really interesting to see how they kind of interrelate. And we might see some of that in what we're talking about, and as we read. And I think even more of it is, maybe we'll do this again and go into Genesis 2 and 3, which is the other creation narrative found in kind of the beginning of Genesis. But because I think some of what those kind of questions too also further get like asked in those chapters. All right, so why don't we go ahead and begin reading the text? So as we kind of go through, we'll go through section by section, and we've broken it up into shorter chunks just to help us in our conversation. So we'll read through a section at a time and then just talk about the section. And as we're reading through, everyone in the chat, feel free to drop in anything that stands out to you or any questions that you have, and we'll see. We'll bring that into our conversation as well. So I will read the first section for us, and And this section is, I'm reading out of the NRSV, not the updated edition because I haven't updated that on my Logos Bible app quite yet. But I will read. This is verses chapter 1, verses 1 through 13. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning the first day. And God said, "Let there be a dome in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." So God made the dome and separated the waters that were under the dome from the waters that were above the dome. And it was so. God called the dome sky, and there was evening and there was morning the second day. And God said, "Let the waters under the sky be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the earth put forth vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees of every kind on earth that bear fruit with the seed in it." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding a seed of every kind, and trees of every kind bearing fruit with the seed in it. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning the third day. All right. Yeah. What things do we notice here? And as well as and anyone in the chat, feel free to put in what you're noticing or any questions that you have from this section as well. Brian or Mack, anything you would like to note in this section?
Something I really like, and thank you for putting in our notes the little grammatical part about it, is the concept of like the let there be. And this is one of those things that grammatically, as you put in there, there's still strength to it. It's still kind of a command. It's going in that direction. But the way it's helpful for me when I think about this to think about a God that is spinning things into existence. There's a communication there. There's like a not just like a no substance to it sort of hope or request. Sorry if you can hear my cat. She's very upset. My wife left and she's having feelings about it. But there's like a conversation happening between God and creation. I'm gonna have to move her. Creation or God and the nothing or whatever it is that's there. And I like that idea that there's this everything came to being in this dialogue. I think is a really beautiful way of, if I'm thinking about this in terms of what does this tell me about who God is to me, I like that relational, that dialogue, that conversation. I think that that's really powerful.
Yeah, I think that's really cool. I love that the note that I put in there, just a little Hebrew kind of thing is it's in the jussive tense in the form, which it's kind of the jussive is kind of a hard concept to fully grasp because in the English we don't really have an equivalent necessarily, but it's kind of like it's more than just there could be, like, right? So instead of God saying, "Oh, there could be land," or "there could be," it's "let there be," but it's not as forceful as the imperative, which is "there must be," "I demand that there is," right? So there is this kind of like middle space of this powerful suggestion of, it's almost to me it almost feels like an invitation, or like this I'm inviting it, and it's really, really cool like thing too in the grammar.
The way I kind of imagine it is almost as if God's saying to whatever there is, like, what if there was, in like that sort of invitational way, like what if there was light? What if there was something new here? And I really like that because it's not a command. It's not saying there is light, but it's not just like a dream. I like how you said an invitation.
I like that question, Isaac. Yeah, if there's anyone in the chat that speaks, a different language that has something that's either adjective or something close to that, or that would be, yeah. Feel free to share. And I see Tara says I may have not gotten to that part of Spanish for sign language, but I don't think either of those languages have that. I don't know. I'm not sure about sign language, and I don't believe Spanish has that particularly in that way. Brian, were you going to say something?
Yeah, for me, like, in one of the notes that I had was it talks about the three forms of cosmos that the earth has, like the formless void, the darkness, and then the wind. And then even in creation, in just that first verse or two that we have, there is already multiple forms of earth. So that then begs the question, well, if there's multiple forms of this creation that God has made, then why can't there be multiple forms of us as living, breathing beings? So
That's a really interesting, like, even just that kind of, even at the beginning where the formless void, there is a plurality. I'm like hearing in the kind of the openness or yeah. And that actually brings me to something that I was thinking about is like the first 3 days, something I always love about this, just the structure of the poetry. I always just love looking at how poetry is structured and just poetic language in general. And the structure of this, like if you think about this as a poem or a poetic narrative, the structure of it is the first 3 days that are kind of there have this kind of repetition of God separating, right? God is like separating day from night, or like and let there be light, and then the darkness and the darkness and the light are separated, and that gives light and night and day. And then the waters above the dome and the waters below the dome are separated, and that becomes the sky and eventually the sea. And then the sea is separated into the waters in the below are separated, and then that's like water and earth, and so the sea and land. And I just love that kind of repetition of, it's almost like all of those things already existed within that space, but God was kind of like making order in that way. And that brings me back a little bit, Mack, to what you were saying about how the people that wrote this were thinking about the world and about God, and if that order kind of the structure of the poem kind of comes from how they conceived of that.
Yeah, I love the structure of it. And I almost decided I might still read the KJV when it's my turn, because I love the poetics of it. I think it's really pretty. I have to go rescue my cat. She got herself stuck. Oh, no, she's good. But yeah, I like the poetics of it. And like you're saying, like I like that it does follow this, not even just like narrative structure, but this poetic structure of introducing these sort of thematic things, and really gives me this idea of this community who's trying to sort of conceptualize how all of this came to being, and what came first and what was important to do first. And it's like the things that are important to do first is the establishment of these systems, these orders, and I like that, because even today, that's the thing we want to do, is we want to get things in order. We want to put things where they go, and sort of make sense of that. But I also like what you're saying, both of you, about this plurality, this fact that it's not so cut and dry. And we'll see that in a little while too, when more things get created. But it's not just this cut and dry. There's still this sort of in between throughout.
Yeah, I see Tara in the chat is like noting that. Tara says, like, I've heard an interpretation about light and darkness being separated explicitly in the story, but in life we have dusk and twilight, and light and darkness is a spectrum. And I think that's actually even touched on in the passage, because it says, and there was evening and there was morning the first day. So there's this transition between the extremes. and they're existing within, but there is this binary. And then also, and so any of the comparisons of there being two separate things in this text is more a part of what's available and not the only two in a binary. Same with land and sea. There are marshes and swamps and quicksand and beaches and mud. It isn't a binary. Wonderfully said. Thank you for bringing that up.
My favorite thing to add to that is a platypus, because what the heck is that? Is always the thing I like to add.
I love the platypus.
But it also, when Tara had put that comment in the chat, it also reminded me of our two-spirited friends and of that nature and of different cultures where non-binary people that are outside of this strict regimen of what is accepted, they are actually revered, they are actually honored, they are put in a place of their knowledge is sacred, and people flock to them for wisdom and stuff. So I tend to go along with the school of thought like that Tara had posted, that it is something that they had a very limited understanding of that time, and they were just describing what they knew how.
Thanks for sharing that, Brian. Anything else that anyone wants to make a note of in this before we move on to the next section? All right. Mack, would you like to read the next set of verses?
Sure. And I'm going to go for it. I'm going to read the KJV because I think it's pretty. And we can, and sorry if it brings up baggage for some people. I know it's a complicated translation, but I'm going to give it a shot and see if I can find something redemptive in it today. So 14, right? Yeah. And God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. And let them be for lights in the firmament of heaven to give light upon the earth." And it was so. And God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. And God set them in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And the evening and the morning were the fourth day. And God said, "Let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that hath life, and fowl that may fly above the earth in the open firmament of heaven." And God created great whales and every living creature that moveth, which the waters brought forth abundantly after their kind, and every winged fowl after his kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let fowl multiply in the earth." And the evening and the morning were the fifth day. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth the living creature after his kind, cattle and creeping things, and beasts of the earth after his kind." And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth after his kind, and cattle after their kind, and everything that creepeth upon the earth after his kind. And God saw that it was good.
That is really pretty. I do really like some
it's
of the
just
language.
really pretty. It brings in more of that poetic stuff that I feel like you lose when you get into more scholarly translations, which obviously very, very important. But when I want to just be like, this is poetry, I always go back.
Yeah, it's really great. It was really interesting. It said the great whales, I think, and God created the great whales. In the NRSV, it says the great sea monsters, right?
This happens constantly between the NRSV and the KJV. Is like, there are so many cool animals, and the KJV is never quite sure how to get them across. You get jackals when it could be ostriches or owls or dragons.
Yeah, it's so interesting. It's just an interesting thing of like seeing how people attempt to like, again, this is like the framework, right? Of like someone in a certain framework being like, well, there are no sea monsters maybe, or like, and then I guess they might have mean whales.
Yeah,
I like the kind of connection of to home, like the deeps, right? With Tiamat, you know, the kind of that the serpent monster of the deeps. And so I just love the poetic nature of that. But I think it's really interesting, the translation of whales.
Yeah, I think it's weird that you get whales here, but later on the KGB's like, and there are totally dragons. It's weird to me. I'm like, here you had to go with whales, but elsewhere it's fine that there are dragons. Okay.
I mean, to be fair, whales are like pretty inspiring and really wild that they exist in the first place. So
this is true.
Well, any kind of observations in this besides our geeking out about whales, again, anyone feel free to put your observations in the chat if you have anything in these kind of verses 14 through 25. One thing that I will just say is, like, again, going back to what I was saying earlier, kind of in the poetic structure. Tara, I was just about to say that, like, it is so interesting that the lights in the sky come after the day and the night. And it's always kind of a weird thing if you think about it, like, how is there light and then there are lights to govern the day and govern the night, but there's like light already exists. It's just an interesting conception of the world, that light can exist without a light source in that way. But it's also, if you follow the structure through, and so we're now we've now done days 4, 5, and part of 6. We haven't gone all the way through 6. But if you follow the structure, if the first 3 days are God's kind of separating these different domains of like separating the day and the night, in day 4, there is God placing the lights to govern over the day and the night. There's something that's placed in that space. And then 2 is separating the waters of above and waters below. And God's placing the birds in the sky and the waters above, and the sea creatures in the waters below. And then the land is separated in day 3 and day 6. God's like placing animals, and there's like creation of animals. So I always think it's a really interesting conception, Tara. Like I find it weird too, but also I think it's quite beautiful to think about this kind of separating and then putting things in there to govern or to have agency within those spaces. I always like that, and I find that fascinating every time I read it.
Yeah, I really like that.
For me, like this just get stuck on the binary of comparison for me, that it's just like, and that for me, that's always been a issue, because like Mack had shared, I too came from a very fundamentalist Christian perspective where it's literal. So for me, like being able to be a part of this and just looking at it from different perspectives is just nice to be able to hear and be a part of.
Yeah, there's something about me, I don't know that I ever really struggled with there being binaries in this text, because I never really saw them as binaries. Because like I think of this concept of the fact that it's in betweens, that's sort of like implied. And I write poetry, so maybe that helps, but I imagine like writing for myself, like I can't possibly name all of the things between point A and point B, so I say point A and I say point B, and I hope that you understand I mean everything in between. And so I kind of, in my head, whenever I read these passages, I didn't realize that until as I was reading, that in my head I read the two things and it's almost like an immediate call and response with my own brain of and everything in between, when I just read it. And I think that is really nice. But even I was just thinking about like the lights to govern and whatnot, and how we have the sun and the moon. And a lot of the times I think we sometimes think of those as like being opposites, of being like, oh, these are two sides of the same coin. But he made the stars also is just like added in there as a tag of like, but they're not the only ones. Like, sure, they're not the only ones. And I like that. Or we have like the birds of the air and the fish of the sea and the beasts of the field. There's more. It's not just these two things that we think of as opposing or polar opposites. There's more there. I didn't think about that till just sort of now, is that we kind of get like this threes coming up, and that doesn't completely work when we think about people, you know, because it's not just like A, B, or I guess other is not always a great way of thinking about that. But I do like it kind of helps with some of the binary, I think.
It's so funny you bring up the other word, because that is one thing that I just like. I almost rather places have like either other and a blank line where I can write in my own option, or they have A, male, B, female, C, non binary, or D, other, or fill in the blank. Because, like you said, there is so much of like, there is that complexity in between. And yeah, I think it's amazing how that this scripture, like even as we're sitting here talking, both like you and I, Mac, are making even like revelations about like what is like sticking out with us. And so that's really cool, like how we're able to bounce off of each other.
This to me always makes me think of the kind of when I hear like this kind of binary naming system, and yeah, I kind of also do that kind of call and response in my brain, Mac, that kind of and everything in between. It kind of sits there implicitly for me. It didn't used to, and because as I grew up in this sort of in the context that I grew up in, it like it was a very much like an either or. And I think that we started, like when you start reading, as we'll see in a little bit later in verse 27, male and female, when you read that as an either or, all the other kind of binary naming also has to be read that way for consistency's sake. And so I think that that's how my brain was trying to handle that when I was little. But obviously it's not true if we look at the world around us, right? But it also makes me think of, as I was just kind of sitting with the kind of this tension of naming, it makes me think of kind of the ways that God can sometimes be referred to as the beginning and the end, or in Revelations 22, the Alpha, I am the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end, the first and the last, right? So that kind of naming of Alpha and Omega being like the beginning of the alphabet and the end, right? So there's this, it's the beginning, end, and everything in between. It's not meaning to say only exclusively. It's this very inclusive way of kind of holding space for all without having to have pages and pages and pages. I mean, I kind of want to see that kind of Genesis creation story where it's just like pages and pages, and God created the platypus and said, and saw that the platypus was created and saw that it was good, right? And just, but like it's, I think there's this kind of implicit holding of that in there.
Yeah.
Jamie, I love your question. How do lights govern? I'm not sure if I have an answer for you.
Yeah, I just looked up the word to see if there was anything that like could help me, and because I was like, I've never thought about that. And I mean, it kind of, the only thing I can think of is like that the sun like gets power over the day, like the sun and the moon aren't competing for the same time is all I can come up with. Like one of them gets sort of dominion over a certain time, but even that's not really true because there are times when you can see both.
Also, part of it makes me wonder about the kind of conception of, in the ancient world, of the heavenly bodies as being kind of representative of divine, or like spirits, or a kind of having divine power, right? And so even understanding it that way, potentially the governing is literally the sense of attributing kind of the divine rule of this particular heavenly body over this time. I don't know, but it's just a really interesting question.
That's a great point. Yeah, I've never even thought about that before, but that's a great point, especially like I have this written down for later, but like these folks aren't monotheists yet. There's definitely more than one divine being for them. And so I like that idea of like, acknowledging that for this group, like there's power there of some kind.
I see that Isaac says sailing navigation. Yeah, absolutely. That definitely would help. And you could interpret this. This star informs me that it's that way, and this star orders me to go that way. Yeah, that's true. There is that. That's an interesting interpretation too. I like that a lot.
Yeah.
There is also the fact of Lucifer and like the fallen star, and like that regard to like lesser, like the struggle of power between. So I mean, that's one thing. Like I don't even like, I looked up the lights thing, and that was the one thing like that I found, and I'm like, of course I would be the one to find that one to mention it, but I thought it was really cool because like we each all found our own little thing about the lights to like go off of, and we all kind of instantaneously were like, okay, searching.
It's one of the reasons I love these conversations, because sometimes they bring up things we've never even considered before. So I love that question, Jamie, because I'd never thought about it. So.
No, I can quote the verse, but I don't think twice about the word that they use for
I
it.
know.
I'm like, yeah, the lights to govern the day. Yeah.
All right. Well, recognizing the time, how about we kind of move on to the next section? Brian, would you like to read the next section for us?
I'm having a little bit of muscle spasm issue, so can you guys, between the two of you, please do that?
Yeah, I got this next one. So this is going to be verse 26 through 31 through the end of chapter 1. Again, this is from the NRSV. Then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth." God said, "See, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so. God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the sixth day. All right. So what's standing out to y'all in this part of the passage?
Sorry. For me, the biggest thing is like in 26 and 27. Like in 26, it says, "Let us make humankind in our image." And then right in verse 27, which is right below it, it says, "So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them." And so for me, it just, what happened between verse 26 and 27 that like caused this change? What changed about the author's targeted community? So even right there, that just shows to me that there's a plurality, even within the communities, that even just this first creation story is even beginning to address. So even within the Bible's own stories, and it's also being like, hey, no, things aren't always as they seem. It's not A and B, like Micah was saying and Mack was saying, or it's not even necessarily other, but like I like to say, as my cat just so graciously demonstrated jumping from one side of my screen to the other, and like that space, like it's like for me that's kind of like how I am, and I feel like that's how this section of scripture is showing like God or creation to be like it's kind of like the chaotic mess of everything all mixed together.
Thanks, Brian. I like that you're bringing up. That is a really interesting grammatical shift. And I was looking in the Hebrew to see, and yeah, it goes from first person singular to first person plural to third person singular. So that's an interesting kind of grammatical shift. And I think there's Mac. I don't know if I know you had like noted some stuff around the idea of Elohim and the plurality of God.
Yeah, which not everybody in my circles loves when I bring it up, but this idea that like Elohim is grammatically plural, but that's the word that gets translated as God by at least one of the proposed sources of the writers of Genesis. And there's a lot of ways that people sort of get themselves around that if they want to, or dive into that. And one of these concepts is like this divine council idea that there's not just one God, that there's this divine council that's all coming together to talk about this creation. And I kind of like that personally, but I also, as Christianity sort of develops into this more, and as the Jewish community develops more into a monotheism, and now if we have from a Christian context read it in that same way as monotheists, it can get a little bit hairy in there to try and figure out what to do about it. But I've heard a couple of other ways of sort of interpreting it, and one, God speaking to both God, self, and all of creation, and saying, let us come together to make humanity like everything else that exists. And I think that goes to what Brian was saying about things being messy and things being complicated. And if there's and everything in between to everything else that God creates, then maybe that happens here as well. Let us make male and female and everything else and everyone else that I like.
I love that idea. I've never heard that interpretation of God speaking to creation. I've heard the divine counsel, and that's typically how I kind of have approached it myself, and kind of, but I've never heard the God speaking to creation and saying to creation, let us create, which I think is really beautiful when you think about the kind of, there's like unity in that and like a coming forth. Yeah, I don't know. The plurality of Elohim, of El being the name, like El being God and a singular, and then him being the plural ending. That is always an interesting thing of like that being God's name, and there is an inherent plurality in God's identity. And I think another way I've heard people attempt from a Christian perspective, which I think I want to caution against doing, is people saying that this is God speaking to the Trinity. This is the Trinity kind of like holding this, but within the kind of tradition that this is written, that's not, like, we have to be careful about kind of erasing kind of original intent, as well as kind of being insensitive to that. And I think there can be a beauty in understanding that the thorough line of like plurality. But I think that's also, it's a not a great place necessarily, in my opinion, to go interpretation wise.
Yeah, I agree. I like what Tara's saying here about how it sort of goes with the let there be thing we talked about earlier of this is a conversation. It's not just sort of a one-sided God says and it is. It works better in the second creation narrative where, the dust of the earth actually takes an active role in the creation of humanity. That doesn't necessarily happen in this version, but I still think it's pretty, and so I'm gonna pretend like it works just as well.
I mean, I think it does. I think it looks. I really like it as well. I just wanted to note a couple of other things that were said in chat. Tara noted that just the plants were called food, which is so true. And every time when I read it too, I also was thinking that, and I was like, it's an interesting thing, and that's noted there, and it's not it's just an interesting thing. And obviously we see the Hebrew people kind of like having like eating it, like taking care of livestock and stuff, and so there wasn't necessarily this, and it wasn't necessarily a vegetarian kind of reading of that, but it's an interesting kind of like concept of how why is that kind of named. It's just fascinating. And then Jenny says this is the first that good is intensified with the very. Yes. There, I love the repetition, and then this is very good. It's this emphasis, I think, of like all of creation together is very good. Yeah. Okay, well, I would love to talk a little bit about kind of the idea of the image of God as well as humans being created before, because I know verse 27 in particular. I'm going to read it for us again. So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. And as I'm sure most of us, if not all of us, are aware, that verse is often used against trans folks, and particularly non-binary and kind of gender expansive people, by conservatives who want to like kind of reinforce this idea of the gender binary as well as this kind of exclusive, or kind of what's it called, a gender essentialist view. How have you experienced kind of this passage being used both in positive and negative ways, and how do you engage with the kind of this idea of creation of God, of male and female in God's image?
Yeah, I think I've heard it. Growing up, I for sure heard it. As you're talking about Micah Melody, of this idea of like, well, obviously, as it says in Genesis 1:27, male and female, and those are your options. There you go. And in turn, that then leads to complementarianism, talking about why only heterosexual relationships are okay, and all of that. It just it's very much one of those slippery slope things, in the way that I've heard them. But I've also, and I've even heard, and I've never gotten a good explanation for this, of like that being part of the image of God, of being this, there's something about this like gender essentialism that like is very important to who God is. And the way sort of I read it now, and the way I've heard it interpreted in more progressive circles, is this idea of, as I said earlier, with the fact that like if all of the rest of creation is complicated, this part is too. And part of this image of God being, I've heard some people talk about as like consciousness or soul, but I'm not sure where I land on where animals fall into sentience and having souls and whatnot. So I don't like that answer as much. But I like this idea of, especially when it comes right there with like the plurality bit, of this idea of like part of the image of God is this plurality, part of it's this creativity, this ability to be more than just one thing, and to be so expansive. Is kind of how I read it now. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing, Mac. I just also noticed that Tara says, continue the thorough line of the rest of the binary is not being actually binary. But I've always typed in chat about the earlier parts of the chapter. Yeah. I mean, yeah. I think that goes along with what you were talking about, Mac, of just that, the plurality, the kind of expansiveness and the diversity. Yeah. How about you, Brian?
I don't know that I really have anything other than like that grammatical difference for me from that particular in like the image, is I'm still figuring out for myself like where I fall with like the creation story and that kind of stuff. And yeah, as you guys can tell, Micah, like, of course, I knew it was gonna happen. But that's Pumpkin, by the way, everyone. That
We
he had
love
to get his 10 seconds. He had to get his 15 seconds of fame in somehow.
Pat cameos, always great. And Pumpkin seems to be having a wonderful time.
Yes.
And one of the things I just to kind of and I like what Mack, as you were talking about the ways that people have thought about what does it mean to be in the image of God, and I often look at things from like a political or social lens, and look at the cultural context of the times, and just recognizing that like the ancient for the peoples in that kind of ancient world, a lot of the kings, a lot of the rulers were seen as kind of like divine representations of their respective gods. Or like the Assyrian king being a divine representative of Asher, right? Like the Pharaoh, the being seen as literally kind of a being literally a representation of Ra on earth. This kind of Pharaoh becoming king after death. And so this idea of like image, carrying the image of a political leader or a figure, kind of like we erect statues, or kind of like there's this way that it carries this sort of divine and political power in the kind of that in the world. It's still today, but in a different context, right? Like it carries showing someone's image, like having photos of people, or like there's power behind being able to reproduce someone's photo. But so I think about it in that context, and I actually really love the idea that humankind, like male and female, every single person is made in the image of God, as opposed to just certain political figures that were rulers at the time that would have been carrying the image of a god. I think that's a really beautiful act of political resistance in my mind, in just the way it kind of shows up in the text. So yeah, that's just my kind of brain of thinking that and kind of going into the social implications.
I like that a lot. Yeah, I don't know that I've ever heard that one before. I appreciate like how that reading carries forward in a way that I think is really important when we read texts like this, to find ways that we can read them that not only reduce harm that has been done with them, but carries it forward into a transformative way of like, how can I read this in a way that it's not just doesn't hurt anybody, but a way that gives me something else. I think that does that.
Yeah, and I love the idea, and that's why I think it's so powerful when we see images of Jesus, for example, represented in either from different ethnic perspectives, like in showing different cultures representing Jesus, or also gender, kind of like thinking about God as using she, her pronouns, or ze, them pronouns, or fey, fair pronouns for God, because it's like there's a power in holding that. So I one of those things that I'm kind of like, I love to think about. Just really quickly, I know we're running close on time. We may not get to the last little section, but I think that's okay, because this is really good conversation. I just noticed that in the chat, we see Jenny says, if we're made in the image of God and male and female, doesn't that mean that God is both? And then doesn't that mean that we can be both? Tara says, I think it does gesture male and female being expressions of God's image. I think it also gestures at God being more expansive than just male and female, and that it is possible to be both, either something else or none. Yeah, I love that. I love the phrase of God being genderful rather than genderless, that there is like a fullness of gender in God, and that we see that kind of expression in human beings. But also that includes folks who are agender or feel detachment from gender as well.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful.
For me, the image that comes across is like, for my own personal like story, is I found out I carried the BRCA gene mutation, which gave me the ability to get my surgeries, and so I had those. And just like that being present, it was like my body's like the way God had designed me was like, oh yeah, by the way, you are on the right path because I was fortunate enough to have that route, and it was like that. Brian, it made me realize Brian's always been in there, so that just to me kind of translates like image of God. Like, okay, if God had created me in everything, then every version of me has existed in some way, space, or in time.
That's really beautiful. I love the idea of every version of me has existed in some way, space, or time. It's just a really beautiful thing to sit with and to think about. Um, well, as we're kind of coming to a close, just want to read one more from the chat. Jamie says, this passage seems to emphasize the flow of night into day and into night. And we all know that day and night are not binaries. I love the idea, how you're highlighting the idea of flow and kind of movement within. I think that's really beautiful too, of seeing the movement of God, the movement of gender, the movement of night into day, and yeah, I think it's really beautiful. Well, as we kind of bring it to a close, any final takeaways that that anyone has? What are you all bringing away from this passage in our conversation?
I think something that I always like, and whenever I read this passage over again, something that sticks with me every time is that, and it was very good. I think it's really easy when we look at like all the messiness and everything that's going on in the world that we get really focused on, I think, chapter 3, the fall. And if you think of that as a fall, which I don't know, but like it's really easy to get hung up on all that stuff. But remembering that everything was created. It sounds like I take it literally. I don't, but bear with me. This idea of like we were all created in this goodness, that we are all very good, that this world is very good. I think is really a comforting reminder when everything looks really bad, to be like there's goodness here somehow, and then it encourages us to go and look for it.
That's beautiful. I love the optimism in that. How about you, Brian? What is your takeaway from this conversation?
That sometimes being different can just be an act of resistance in and of itself. I really liked how that topic was brought up during this conversation. So.
Thanks, Brian. I'm so glad that you were able to join us, and really appreciate your perspective that you're bringing in. I think for me, the goodness, I think, is standing out to me as well. Just the repetition of goodness, that it is good, it is very good. And I think I need that kind of hope and that optimism right now. And just the reminder that at the core, there is this like hope that we can be a creation or a people, a community, a planet that is very good and exists in harmony with one another and cares for. We didn't get to talk about the idea of dominion, but so often that's been used to like subjugate the world in a really bad way. But I think when you think about it from a really good way, it's about care. And I think I need that optimism and that hope right now. So thank you for bringing that up too, Mack. And well, thank you all for jumping in and for participating in the chat. And thank you, Mack and Brian, for coming on and for your great perspectives and observations and questions. And our next Bible study live will be on August 21st. So keep an eye out for that. Looking forward to that. And otherwise, we'll see you very soon. So take care, everyone.